Overlord Kunix of the Methodical Union sat in his designated observation pod. All 6 of his optical sensors focused on the holographic display hovering before him. Around the circular chamber of the Galactic Culinary Safety Council, representatives from 218 species watched the same footage with varying degrees of horror, confusion, and what could only be described as existential bewilderment. Ambassador Werlop, whose species prided itself on achieving 99.8% efficiency in all juvenile training protocols, made a sound that his translator rendered as something between a gasp and a mechanical failure. His chitinous plates rattled with distress. "Rewind it," Kunix commanded, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had witnessed countless atrocities across the galaxy, but never quite anything like this. "I need to see it again." The technician complied, and the hologram reset to timestamp 80842, Standard Galactic Time, location, Human Colony Outpost, number 26, Sector 8 Prime. Here's what they saw, and here's why it made 218 species question everything they thought they knew about raising young. A human instructor named Hollis stood in what humans called a classroom, though it looked more like a controlled chaos zone with tiny chairs and colorful wall coverings. He was a typical adult human specimen: binocular vision, opposable thumbs, that unsettling predator stillness that marked his species as apex hunters who'd climb to the top of their food chain through persistence, tool use, and an apparently limitless capacity for violence when necessary. But it wasn't Hollis that had called this emergency session. It was the 2 small humans sitting at a low table, their predator eyes focused with intense concentration on the task before them: pouring cereal into a bowl. The twins, Kai and Opal, were 5 standard years old. 5. Which meant they were young even by human standards, but old enough that they should have basic motor control, spatial reasoning, and an understanding of cause and effect. Their species, after all, had conquered their homeworld's food chain by the time they were walking upright. These cubs descended from hunters who could track prey for days, who could throw projectiles with deadly accuracy, who could coordinate complex pack tactics. And yet, Kai held the cereal box, brightly colored, covered in what appeared to be a cartoon representation of a food item, because humans like to anthropomorphize everything, including their nutrients, and tipped it toward the bowl. Hollis stood nearby, arms crossed, watching with that calm predator patience. The cereal poured out, and poured, and poured. The bowl filled quickly. Then it overfilled. Cereal pieces began cascading over the rim, bouncing off the table, scattering across the floor in a cascade of crunchy processed grain that made Werlop's efficiency-oriented brain want to short-circuit. Kai kept pouring. "Stop," Werlop whispered at the Eburit's hologram, as if the human cub could hear him across space and time. "Stop pouring. The container is full. Stop." Kai did not stop. The cereal box finally emptied about halfway, and when the small predator set it down, there was a mountain, an actual geometric mountain, of cereal rising from the bowl, defying physics and common sense in equal measure. Pieces rolled off the summit like an avalanche in miniature. The council chamber fell silent. Then Kai looked up at Hollis, and here's where it got truly baffling. The cub was smiling. Not crying, not displaying signs of distress at the obvious failure. Smiling. With teeth. Because humans were predators who smiled with their bone-crushing implements. "I made a cereal volcano," Kai announced, pride radiating from every syllable. And Hollis, the adult human, the supposedly wise guardian of these tiny hunters in training, he laughed. Actually laughed. "You sure did, Kai. That's one impressive volcano. Now, what do you think happens when we add the milk?" "Oh no," Kunix muttered, because he could see where this was going. Kai picked up the milk container with both hands, motor control still developing, depth perception clearly still calibrating, and poured. The white liquid hit the cereal mountain, and for approximately 2 seconds, the cereal absorbed it. Then the laws of physics remembered they existed, and milk began flowing over the edge of the bowl in a slow, inexorable waterfall. It pooled on the table. It dripped onto the floor. It created a dairy moat around the bowl that would have required 3 standard cleaning units to properly sanitize. Kai's assessment of this disaster? Perfect, the council chamber erupted. Well, erupted in the polite, procedural way that galactic governing bodies erupt, which meant a lot of agitated shuffling, translator static, and the biological equivalent of deeply troubled sighing across multiple species. High Overseer Mulkoth, whose people didn't allow their juveniles to handle any resources until they'd passed 18 theoretical examinations and achieved 95% accuracy in simulation, stood from his seat. This cannot be the standard. Surely this is an outlier, a defective specimen. Humans wouldn't systematically allow their predator cubs to waste resources like this. Watch, Kunix said quietly, because he'd already reviewed the full footage. And what came next was somehow worse. Hollis handed Opal, the other twin, a fresh bowl. Your turn, Opal. Remember what we talked about. Pour slowly and watch the bowl. Opal nodded with the seriousness of a small predator accepting a hunting lesson. She gripped the cereal box, different motor control approach, slightly better coordination, and tipped it. The council leaned forward collectively. Opal poured with admirable restraint for about 3 seconds. The cereal tinkled into the bowl in a controlled stream. It filled halfway, then 3/4, then, and here's where it got interesting, in the way that watching a star go supernova is interesting. Opal apparently decided that halfway through the pour was the perfect time to experiment with velocity. She tipped the box further. The stream became a torrent. The bowl filled, overfilled, and cereal began constructing what could only be described as an architectural structure rising from the ceramic base. By the time Opal stopped pouring, and she stopped of her own volition, which was something, she'd created a cereal tower that actually had structural integrity. It rose a good 6 inches above the bowl's rim, individual pieces interlocked in a way that suggested either incredible luck or the unconscious application of engineering principles. Opal, Hollis said, and the council held its collective breath for the correction, the teaching moment, the disciplinary action that would surely follow. That's a really creative approach. What do you think will happen when we add milk to that structure? Opal considered this with the gravity of a military strategist planning an invasion. It's gonna fall down. Want to test your hypothesis? Yeah. Werlop made a sound that his translator couldn't even parse. His species learned fluid dynamics through rigorous mathematical study. This human cub was about to learn it by creating a dairy disaster. Opal poured the milk. The tower immediately destabilized, collapsing inward as the liquid saturated the foundation. Milk and cereal sloshed over the side in a wave that would have made oceanographers weep. It splattered across the table, onto Opal's clothes, and created abstract art patterns on the floor that would require industrial cleaning equipment. Opal's response? She looked at Kai, and they both raised their small predator hands and slapped them together in what humans called a high five, a gesture of victory and celebration. They were celebrating the mess, the waste, the catastrophic failure of a basic task that most species mastered before they could walk. "Rewind it again," someone called from the council seats. "There must be something we're missing, some cultural context, some explanation." But Kunix kept the footage rolling because the third attempt was still coming, and honestly, he needed the other council members to see the full scope of what they were dealing with. Hollis produced a third bowl. How about you two work together this time? Kai, you pour the cereal. Opal, you tell him when to stop. This was it. This was where the adult human would guide them toward success, toward efficiency, toward the proper execution of a simple task. The council relaxed slightly. Kai and Opal exchanged a look, and humans were predators with incredibly sophisticated nonverbal communication. So that look contained entire conversations that the council's technology couldn't fully parse. Then Kai picked up what remained of the cereal box, and Opal positioned herself with the milk. "Ready?" Kai asked. "Ready," Opal confirmed. They poured simultaneously. "Oh, no," Kunix said again, because what unfolded next could only be described as deliberate chaos orchestrated by two tiny humans who had apparently learned nothing from the previous attempts, or had learned something entirely different from what any reasonable species would take from the experience. Cereal and milk hit the bowl together, creating a vortex effect. The bowl filled instantly. They didn't stop. Cereal pieces danced in the milk tsunami. The bowl overflowed from all sides simultaneously. The table became a lake. Milk dripped onto the floor in streams. Cereal floated in the dairy sea like tiny, shipwrecked grains. It was beautiful in the way that natural disasters are beautiful. Awesome, terrible, and completely unstoppable once initiated. When they finally stopped pouring, not because the bowl was properly filled, but because they'd simply run out of materials, Kai and Opal surveyed their creation with the satisfaction of artists completing a masterpiece. "We made the perfect storm," Kai announced. "It's exactly right," Opal agreed. And Hollis, this adult human predator who should have been teaching precision and efficiency and resource management, he looked at the catastrophe before him and smiled. "That's some excellent teamwork, you two. High five." They did, with wet, milk-covered hands, leaving little predator palm prints on each other. "Now," Hollis said, grabbing towels from a nearby cabinet that was clearly stocked for exactly this kind of disaster, "what's the next step after we make a mess?" "Clean it up," both cubs shouted together. "That's right. Let's practice our cleaning skills." The footage ended there, freezing on the image of two small humans enthusiastically wiping milk off a table, while cereal crunched under their feet, and their instructor supervised with that same calm predator patience. The council chamber sat in stunned silence for 38 seconds, a record for an assembly that usually couldn't agree on anything. Finally, Werlop spoke, his voice small and confused. "I don't understand. These are apex predators, forward-facing eyes, tool-using manipulators, pack-hunting social structure. Their species conquered their planet's food chain through superior coordination and planning. And they are teaching their cubs that this," he gestured at the frozen hologram of the disaster zone, "is acceptable?" "Not just acceptable," Kunix corrected grimly. "Perfect." The cubs called it perfect, and the adult agreed with them. "This must be an isolated incident," Mulkoth insisted. "One unconventional instructor with questionable methods. The humans couldn't have become a spacefaring civilization if this is how they raise their young." But Kunix had already pulled up the next file. And the next. And the next. The pattern, as it turned out, was everywhere. Human predator cubs, from one end of their territory to the other, failing at tasks that should have been simple for their species. And their adults, consistently, inexplicably, allowing it to happen, encouraging it, even. The question wasn't whether this was isolated. The question was why an apex predator species would systematically teach their cubs that catastrophic failure was not just acceptable, but somehow ideal. And that question, as the council was about to learn, had an answer that would make them reconsider everything they thought they knew about raising young in a dangerous universe. But first, they needed to see just how deep this rabbit hole, another human predator metaphor naturally, actually went. Kunix gestured to the display technician, and the holographic interface exploded into a grid of footage. Hundreds of clips, all catalogued, all showing variations on the same theme that had just traumatized the council with the serial incident. I spent the last rotation cycle reviewing surveillance data from human colonies across 6 sectors, Kunix began, his voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a diagnosis of a terminal illness. This is not an isolated incident. This is systematic. This is intentional. Werlop's translator emitted a sound like grinding gears. Show us! The first clip expanded to fill the central display. A human dwelling, modest but comfortable, with a yard space behind it. A young predator cub, maybe 10 standard years old, named Tobias, worked at a wooden construction project. His small hands manipulated tools with the developing coordination of his species, cutting pieces of wood, hammering them together. He is building a nesting structure for avian life forms, Kunix narrated. Watch! The structure took shape over the time-compressed footage. The roof attached at an angle that would make any engineer wince. The walls didn't quite align, leaving gaps that defeated the entire purpose of shelter. The entrance hole was asymmetrical. The base wasn't level. No bird would inhabit this death trap, Mulkoth observed, built by a creature whose ancestors hunted birds no less. The irony is— Wait! Kunix interrupted. The footage continued. Tobias stepped back, examined his work with those predator eyes that could track movement with deadly precision, and smiled. His adult guardians emerged from the dwelling, a male and female pair, standard human breeding configuration. They looked at the lopsided disaster their cub had created. Surely this was where the correction would happen. The male human picked up the structure, tested its weight, nodded. This is great work, Tobias. Really creative design. Let's hang it in the tree. They hung it. The crooked birdhouse dangled from a branch like a monument to failure. The council waited for something to make sense. 3 rotations later in the footage, and here's where it got offensive to basic logic, a bird actually moved in. Not just any bird, but a whole bird family, raising their young in this structurally unsound death trap that should have repelled any creature with functioning survival instincts. How? Werlop asked the universe. Humans call it charming, Kunix said, his tone suggesting he'd checked the translation 17 times and it still didn't make sense. The next clip appeared without preamble. Kitchen setting. Early morning based on the light levels. 2 human cubs, twins again, because apparently humans produced multiples and then let them all fail together, named Milo and Poppy, approximately 8 years old. They stood before a cooking surface with ingredients spread across the counter. They are attempting to prepare pancakes, Kunix explained, a simple thermal application of mixed ingredients to create a basic nutrition disk. Observe. Milo cracked eggs. Well, cracked was generous. Demolished was more accurate. Shell fragments scattered into the bowl like shrapnel. Poppy poured flour, missing the bowl by a margin that would have been impressive if it wasn't so catastrophic. A white cloud erupted, coating both cubs, the counter, and what appeared to be a significant portion of the kitchen. They have better eyesight than my entire species, Werlop said, his voice climbing into ranges his translator labeled as distressed. Binocular vision, depth perception evolved for hunting. How are they missing a stationary bowl? The mixing process that followed would haunt efficiency experts for generations. Liquid sloshed over the sides. More flour added. Too much, then too little in overcorrection. The consistency went from soup to paste to something that resembled construction material. When they finally poured the batter onto the heating surface, the shapes that emerged were geometrically impossible. One pancake looked like a deformed star. Another resembled something that might have been a circle, if circles could have existential crises. A third was burnt on one side, raw on the other, defying the basic principles of heat distribution. The adult humans, parents, guardians, whatever humans called the predators responsible for raising predator cubs, entered the kitchen. They surveyed the flour-coated disaster zone, the destroyed eggs, the mutant pancakes. The female humans spoke first. "Wow, you two made breakfast all by yourselves? That's wonderful." They sat down, as a family, and ate the disasters. Every single geometrically impossible, thermally inconsistent pancake. "Delicious," the male human declared, his expression suggesting he might actually mean it, which was somehow more disturbing than if he'd been lying. Mulkoth stood, his posture radiating the kind of agitation that preceded formal accusations. "This is neglect, possibly abuse. These are predator cubs of an apex species, and they are being allowed to waste resources, create hazards, and develop improper techniques that will impair their survival capabilities." "There's more," Kunix said quietly, pulling up another file. This one showed a 4-year-old cub named Ivy attempting to secure footwear, a task that most species automated or simplified, but humans, for reasons known only to their strange predator brains, insisted on using complex lacing mechanisms that required fine motor control and spatial reasoning. Ivy's small predator hands fumbled with the laces, creating knots that would baffle professional sailors. Her adult guardian, the female parent, sat nearby, watching. Just watching. For 20 standard minutes, she watched this tiny predator struggle with a task that could have been completed in 30 seconds with proper instruction. The Council's efficiency experts made sounds that their translators rendered as mathematical impossibilities. "In the Precision Collective," Werlop said, his voice tight with incomprehension, "we raise our young in controlled simulation environments. They do not interact with physical resources until they achieve 98% accuracy in virtual space. They master each skill theoretically before application. By the time they are this cub's age, they can perform 342 distinct tasks with optimal efficiency. In the methodical union," Kunix added, "juveniles complete 18 examinations before handling any materials. They study cause and effect, resource management, and procedural optimization for 3 standard years before their first practical application." "My people," Mulkoth said, his entire posture suggesting he was personally offended by the footage, "do not permit our young to access resources until they can recite the consequences of misuse from memory. They understand failure before they risk experiencing it." "And yet," Kunix said, gesturing to the frozen image of Ivy, who had finally tied her shoes into something resembling a bow, even if it was lopsided, and would definitely come undone within minutes. "The humans do this." Another clip. An 11-year-old cub named Theo attempting to cook. Grilled cheese, supposedly one of the simplest human food preparations, requiring only thermal application to bread and dairy product. The smoke alarm activated. Twice. The bread carbonized on one side. The cheese remained solid on the other. Instead of prohibiting the cub from further attempts, the adult human, parent configuration, male this time, showed him heat adjustment controls and said, "Try again. That's how we learn." Try again. As if the first catastrophic failure wasn't sufficient data to indicate this approach wasn't working. A 6-year-old named Willow painting what was labeled as a family portrait. Everyone looked like blob creatures from a nightmare dimension, abstract interpretations of human forms that would make identification impossible in any legal or medical context. It went on the refrigerator, in the primary display position, where visitors would see it. The council watched clip after clip, the pattern repeating with variations, but always the same core principle. Human predator cubs attempting tasks, failing spectacularly, and being encouraged to continue. "This is madness," Mulkoth declared, his voice carrying the weight of someone stating an obvious truth. "These are apex predators. Their cubs fail constantly and face no correction, no punishment, no remedial training. How did this species conquer anything? How did they survive their own planet, let alone achieve space travel?" Werlop's appendages moved in patterns that indicated frantic calculation. The inefficiency alone should have eliminated them through natural selection. The resource waste, the time expenditure, the development of improper neural pathways through repeated failure. By all models, this species should have gone extinct. And yet, Kunix said, pulling up one final piece of data that made the entire display shimmer with significance, humanity went from first flight to orbital stations in 68 years. From orbital stations to interstellar travel in another 80. They now occupy 42 systems and maintain colonies on 63 worlds. Their technological innovation rate exceeds galactic average by 320%. Their crisis response metrics are the highest recorded across all known species. Silence filled the chamber like water filling a breached hull. "I propose formal investigation," Mulkoth said. "We send an observation team to human space. We document their cub-rearing practices. We determine if this is somehow, impossibly, connected to their success rather than in spite of it." "Seconded," Werlop added immediately. The vote passed unanimously, because 218 species had just watched predator cubs fail at pouring cereal, and somehow those same predators had built an empire among the stars. The disconnect was too large to ignore, too significant to dismiss. Somewhere, somehow, this was connected. And the Galactic Council needed to understand how before this human approach to raising cubs spread to other species, or worse, before they had to acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, their own perfectly efficient methods were missing something fundamental. The observation team would deploy within 2 rotations. They would watch, they would document, they would learn, and what they learned would change everything. The transport vessel deposited 3 observers at Human Colony Outpost, Natria 26, with minimal ceremony. Kunix adjusted his environmental suit, unnecessary for life support, but helpful for sensor arrays. Werlop's chitinous plates clicked nervously as he triple-checked his recording equipment. Zilmoth, the warrior species representative, simply stood with the stillness of a predator evaluating potential threats. "Cultural exchange program," Kunix reminded them both. "We are here to learn about human customs. We observe, we document, we do not interfere." "We are here to witness systematic failure," Werlop corrected quietly, "and determine how a species survives it." The colony administrator, a human named Patricia. Classification: adult female. Threat assessment: moderate. Greeted them with that unsettling human expression that involved showing teeth, smiling. predators smiling at visitors. Welcome. We're honored to host you. I've arranged for you to shadow several families over the next 6 rotations. Full access, complete transparency. We want you to see real human life. Real human life, as it turned out, was a constant state of controlled chaos, barely distinguishing itself from outright disaster. Rotation 1 began at dawn. The observers positioned themselves in the dwelling of the Winters family. The serial twins had to be observed in their natural habitat. Kai and Opal, now age 8, moved through morning routines with the casual inefficiency that seemed to characterize their entire species. Breakfast involved more spills. Getting dressed took 3 times longer than optimal. Toothbrushing somehow resulted in water on the mirror, the counter, and inexplicably on the ceiling. But it was mid-morning when the real education started. A 4-year-old cub named Ivy sat on the floor, small predator hands gripping shoelaces with intense concentration. Her mother sat nearby with a communication device, occasionally glancing up, but mostly allowing the cub to struggle. "Why does she not intervene?" Werlop whispered, his translator barely audible. "The cub is creating impossible knots. This will take—" He checked his chronometer. "We are at 18 minutes now. Optimal instruction time. 4 minutes." Ivy's face scrunched with concentration, tiny predator features displaying frustration, but not surrender. Her fingers fumbled, pulled wrong loops, created new tangles. 20 minutes? 22 minutes? Finally, something resembling a bow emerged. Lopsided, loose, definitely temporary. Ivy looked up at her mother with triumph radiating from her expression. "I did it!" "You sure did, sweetheart. All by yourself." Zilmoth made a sound in his throat. "In my culture, a warrior cub who took this long to prepare for movement would be left behind by the pack. Efficiency is survival." "Yet she is not being left behind," Kunix observed, watching the mother-cub interaction with those analytical sensors. "Continue watching." Midday brought them to another dwelling. Theo, now 12 standard years old, stood in the kitchen with ingredients spread before him. The observers recognized the setup from the footage: cooking instruction, unsupervised application. "He is the grilled cheese cub," Werlop noted, "the one who activated smoke alarms and carbonized bread." Theo prepared the meal with slightly better coordination than his previous attempt, but only slightly. He still misjudged heating temperature. The bread still burnt at the edges. The smoke alarm remained mercifully silent, but only because he'd learned to catch the problem 30 seconds earlier than before. His parent, male configuration, sitting at the table with work materials, glanced up when Theo swore quietly at the burnt edge. "Flip it faster next time. The pan's hotter than you think." That was it. That was the entire intervention. 1 sentence, then back to work. Theo scraped the burnt parts into waste disposal, prepared another, adjusted his timing. This one came out better. Not perfect. The cheese distribution was uneven. One corner remained slightly raw, but edible. He ate it himself. His parent never inspected it, never evaluated it, never verified the quality. "How do they ensure safety?" Werlop asked, agitation making his translator crackle. "How do they confirm proper technique? How do they prevent the development of dangerous habits?" "I do not think they do," Kunix replied slowly. Evening brought them to the dwelling of Willow, now age 8. She sat at a table with painting materials, chromatic liquids in containers, absorbent surfaces for application, brushes for precision work. She painted with the abandon of someone who had never been told that art required accuracy. Colors mixed into combinations that hurt Werlop's optical sensors. Shapes overlapped without regard for spatial relationships. The final product resembled nothing in known reality. Her parents entered, surveyed the abstract chaos, and placed it on the refrigeration unit's display surface. Prime visibility location, where it would be seen by all dwelling visitors. That is not encouragement, Zilmoth said flatly. That is delusion. Teaching a cub that failure is success creates warriors who cannot assess threats accurately. It creates casualties. But something nagged at Kunix, something in the pattern that didn't quite fit the simple narrative of humans are irrational. Rotation. 3 brought clarity. They returned to observe Kai and Opal, the original serial catastrophe cubs. The twins stood in their dwelling's common area, surrounded by blankets, furniture cushions, and structural determination. "We're building a fort," Kai announced when he noticed the observers watching. "A defensive structure," Zilmoth translated, interest peaking. "This is warrior training?" "This is play," the human parent corrected, amused. "But sure, call it warrior training if you want." The observers watched with increasing fascination as the fort collapsed, repeatedly. The blankets slipped from their anchoring points. The cushions couldn't support the weight. The structure tumbled into chaos 6 times, then 8, then 12. "They are not learning," Werlop said, but his voice carried less certainty now. "They repeat the same failed approach." "No," Kunix said, sensors focusing intently. "Watch their hands. Watch their approach. Each attempt is different." Rotation 13. Kai tried securing the blanket with heavier objects. Failed, but learned weight distribution. Rotation 15. Opal attempted a different architectural approach. Lower profile, broader base. Collapsed, but slower collapse, indicating improved structural logic. Rotation 19. Together, combining Kai's weight distribution, knowledge with Opal's architectural modification, they created something that held. Not perfectly. It sagged in one corner, the entrance was barely large enough to crawl through, but it stood. They crawled inside their imperfect fort and made sounds of victory. "They did not succeed 19 times, Zilmoth said slowly, his warrior brain processing combat applications. They failed 18 times, and each failure taught them something they could not learn from instruction." Kunix's sensors brightened. "Continue." Later that rotation, they observed Tobias, the birdhouse cub, now 12 years old, working on actual colony maintenance. A hydroponics nutrient distribution system had malfunctioned, and the standard repair protocols weren't resolving it. The adult engineers stood around the system, discussing approaches, all conventional, all bimanual. Tobias crouched beside the system, examining it from an angle the adults weren't considering. His young predator brain, still forming neural pathways, approached the problem without the constraints of proper methodology. "What if the blockage is before the main valve?" he suggested. "Like, what if something's stuck in the pre-filter that's not showing on diagnostics?" The engineers looked at him with that expression adults gave cubs who suggested obvious impossibilities. "The pre-filter doesn't get accessed because nothing should get past the initial screening. Yeah, I know. But my birdhouse had a gap in the design, and birds still nested there because they used it differently than I intended. So maybe something's using the pre-filter differently than designed?" Silence. Then one engineer pulled up system specifications, traced the logic, and made a sound of realization. "He's right. If debris entered during the last maintenance cycle before screening activation." They opened the pre-filter. Debris had indeed accumulated in a pattern that bypassed normal detection, but created system-wide inefficiency. The young human cub had solved what trained engineers missed. How? Werlop's translator nearly sparked out. Kunix watched Tobias return to his duties, watched the engineers implement the solution. He learned spatial thinking from building unsuccessful birdhouses. He learned that failure in design does not mean failure in application. He learned to see problems from angles that proper training would have eliminated. Rotation 6 brought the revelation into sharp focus. They observed teenage cubs, 16 to 19 years old, operating throughout the colony. These near-adult predators ran critical systems, managed complex operations, made decisions that affected colony survival. And they operated with something the observers had never seen combined in other species: complete technical competence paired with fearless creativity. Lex, 19 years old, managed the primary hydroponics bay that fed 300 colonists. They moved through the space with casual confidence, adjusting systems, troubleshooting problems, implementing solutions that occasionally violated standard protocols but consistently worked. When Werlop asked how they'd learned such complex systems, Lex laughed, that human sound indicating amusement at something simultaneously serious and absurd. Lots of burnt plants and flooded floors when I was younger. My parents let me maintain a small garden plot starting at age 6. I killed everything the first year, most things the second year. By year 5, I was growing vegetables that actually tasted good. By year 10, I understood plant biology better than most textbooks, because I'd failed in every possible way first. Your parents allowed you to kill plants for 5 years? Werlop asked, translator nearly unable to process the concept. They allowed me to learn what plants needed by discovering what happened when those needs weren't met. Big difference. Zilmoth had gone very still, the way warriors do when they recognize something dangerous. You were not taught to succeed. You were taught to fail safely. I was taught that failing doesn't mean I'm a failure, Lex corrected. Huge difference. Later, observing Theo, now 13, the grilled cheese survivor, helping coordinate younger cubs during a routine evacuation drill, Kunix saw the pattern complete itself. Theo kept the smaller cubs calm through chaos, adapted when the primary exit route was blocked in the simulation, improvised solutions when communications failed. He'd learned patience from burning countless meals. He'd learned adaptation from repeated failure. He'd learned that problems had multiple solutions, because he'd found 17 wrong answers before discovering right ones. As the observers returned to their temporary quarters that rotation, Zilmoth spoke first. I understand now. We raise our young to be sharp blades kept in protective sheaths. Humans raise their cubs to be blades being forged. The process looks chaotic, Werlop added quietly, his earlier agitation replaced by something approaching awe. Because forging is chaotic. Kunix accessed his comprehensive notes, the patterns now obvious in retrospect. They overflow the cereal bowl 3 times, not because they cannot learn precision. They overflow it 3 times, because they must first learn that failure is survivable, that mistakes can be corrected, that perfection is not required for progress. A warrior who fears failure hesitates, Zilmoth said, his warrior philosophy aligning with observed data. A warrior who has failed safely strikes without hesitation because failure is familiar, survivable, instructive. Humans do not raise perfect cubs, Kunix concluded. They raise adaptable ones, and adaptability, we are learning, surpasses perfection when circumstances become unpredictable. Which was when the colony alarms began screaming, and the observers learned exactly how unpredictable circumstances could become, and how human cubs responded when chaos was no longer controlled. The alarm carried a frequency that bypassed rational thought and triggered pure survival instinct across every species present. Kunix's sensors immediately began threat assessment. Werlop's plates locked into defensive configuration. Silmoth's hand moved toward a weapon he wasn't carrying. The human cubs didn't panic. That was the first thing the observers noticed. The thing that made no sense according to every juvenile development model in the galactic database. The colony's emergency lighting activated, bathing corridors in red warning illumination, and the small predators moved with purpose instead of fear. Coolant leak, reactor section. Patricia's voice came through communication systems, clipped and professional. All non-essential personnel to designated safe zones. Engineering teams respond immediately. Through the windows of their observation position, Kunix watched human families mobilize. Adults moved toward crisis stations, and the cubs, those fumbling, cereal-spilling, pancake-burning cubs, walked calmly toward marked shelter areas. Not running, not crying. Walking with the discipline of trained soldiers who'd practiced this exact scenario enough times that muscle memory overrode panic. Kai and Opal, the 8-year-old twins, took charge of 3 younger cubs, 5-year-olds who barely came up to their shoulders. "Hold hands," Kai instructed, his young predator voice carrying authority. "Stay together. Count off." The little ones counted off like military cadets. "They are children," Werlop whispered, his translator barely functioning through his shock. "Predator cubs barely past infancy. How are they not terrified?" "Because," Zilmoth said quietly, understanding blooming in his warrior brain, "they have been terrified of smaller things many times before. They failed at cereal, failed at tying shoes, failed at building blanket forts. Each small failure taught them that fear is temporary, and problems have solutions." In the engineering section, something more remarkable unfolded. Lex, the 19-year-old hydroponics operator, received communication through their headset while managing the plant bay. Their expression shifted from concentration to calculation. "You need emergency coolant, and the backup system is down? Wait. The hydroponics water circulation system shares adjacent infrastructure. If we reroute the main pumps, bypass the nutrient injection array, and cycle pure water through the secondary cooling interchange." An adult engineer's voice crackled back. "That system was never designed for thermal load transfer." "No, but I've flooded this bay 11 times learning its capacity limits. The pumps can handle triple current volume. The pipe infrastructure is overbuilt because the original colony planners expected expansion that never happened. It'll work." "How do you know?" "I don't. But I've been wrong enough times to know what being wrong feels like. And this doesn't feel wrong." 3 minutes later, improvised coolant flow began cycling through repurposed hydroponics infrastructure. Temperature readings in the reactor section stabilized. Crisis metrics shifted from critical to manageable. Meanwhile, Theo, 13 years old, the cub who once burned grilled cheese and set off smoke alarms, moved through the shelter area where 30 younger cubs waited with their families. His calm presence, his patient answers to frightened questions, his ability to keep chaos organized came from hours of learning patience while watching cheese refuse to melt properly. "Is the station going to explode?" a 5-year-old asked, voice trembling. "Nope. The adults are fixing it right now. And even if they couldn't, we have 17 backup systems. Want to know a secret?" Theo crouched to eye level. "I used to be scared during drills. But my parent told me that being scared just means you're smart enough to recognize danger. The trick is being scared and doing the right thing anyway." Kunix recorded everything, sensors capturing data that would reshape galactic understanding of juvenile development. The crisis resolved in 2 hours. Coolant leak contained. Systems restored. No casualties. No injuries, just efficient problem-solving from adults and cubs working in concert. As emergency lighting shifted back to normal, Lex emerged from the hydroponics bay, clothes soaked with water from manual valve operations, face showing exhaustion and satisfaction in equal measure. "How did you know that would work?" Kunix asked directly. Lex smiled, that predator expression of teeth and triumph. "I didn't know. I guessed based on patterns I learned from failing 1,000 times at smaller things. Every flooded floor taught me water pressure. Every burnt plant taught me system limits. Every mistake taught me that trying something unconventional is better than watching disaster unfold while waiting for perfect solutions." 6 hours later, the observers stood before the Galactic Council's emergency session via holographic transmission. Human cub rearing is not neglect. Kunix delivered his findings with absolute certainty. It is preparation for apex survival in unpredictable environments. He displayed footage of the cubs during crisis. Calm, coordinated, creative. They overflow the cereal bowl 3 times, not because they cannot learn precision, but because they must first learn that failure is survivable. A predator cub who fears mistakes will freeze when perfect solutions do not exist. A predator cub who has failed safely 300 times will improvise solution 301 without hesitation. Werlop added his data. Human cubs who experience controlled failure show 340% better crisis response than our optimally trained young. Their methods appear inefficient until circumstances require adaptation. Then, they surpass all projections. Zilmoth provided the warrior assessment. "We raise sharp blades inside the protective sheaths. Humans forge blades through repeated tempering. The forging looks destructive, but the result is a weapon that bends without breaking." The council chamber filled with the alien equivalent of thoughtful silence. "But what if the bowl actually breaks?" someone finally asked. "Then the human cub learns that bowls can break," Kunix responded. "And next time, they are more careful. Or they learn to clean shattered ceramic. Or they invent unbreakable bowls. That is the point. Every failure is education. Every mistake is practice for larger problems." Back on the colony, Kai and Opal, now age 9, having lived through their first real emergency, stood in a classroom with new 5-year-old cubs learning morning routines. A small cub attempted to pour cereal. The box tipped. Cereal overflowed. Then overflowed again. The little predator looked up with worried eyes. Kai crouched down, grinning. "Want to know a secret? I flooded my bowl 3 times when I was your age." "Really? Really? My teacher told me it was perfect." "But I made a mess." Opal joined her twin, both older cubs radiating the confidence of survivors who'd learned through failure. "That's how learning works. You make messes while the messes don't matter. So when something really matters, like yesterday, when the station had problems, you already know that messes can be fixed. So, it's okay? It's perfect. Now let's try again. And if it overflows, we'll clean it up and call it practice. That's how predators learn, by missing a few times before we catch the prey." The small cub smiled, picked up the cereal box, and poured again with slightly better coordination. Still overflowed. Still created a mess. Still perfect. Because somewhere in the galaxy, 218 species were beginning to understand that humans didn't teach their cubs to pour cereal. They taught them to survive the universe by learning that overflow was temporary. Failure was educational, and calling a mess perfect 3 times before getting it right was the most human and most powerful lesson of all.